In the vast expanse of the universe, the Galactic Zoo was a place of prestige. It housed creatures from every known corner of the cosmos, each species a testament to the biological diversity that filled the galaxy. For most alien visitors, it was a source of awe. For Gavin Ward, the only human zookeeper in this sprawling interstellar collection, it was his daily life. His role was simple in theory: maintain the Earth exhibit, care for the animals that came from his home planet, and ensure they thrived in this foreign environment. But the reality was far from simple. To the other alien keepers, Gavin was something of a joke. They towered over him, physically, intellectually, technologically. In their eyes, humanity was a primitive species, still stuck in the early stages of galactic evolution. These aliens belonged to ancient civilizations that had mastered the stars while humans had barely learned to explore their own solar system. Gavin's very presence among them seemed like an oversight, an odd exception to the rule of more advanced species holding these prestigious roles. It wasn't long before the mockery began. Most days, as Gavin went about his work, cleaning enclosures, feeding the animals, and monitoring their health, alien keepers would wander by, sneering or laughing at the sight of him. They made no effort to hide their disdain. To them, humans were quaint at best, laughable at worst. Gavin kept his head down and endured it. He had always been the quiet type, the kind of person who found solace in his work and in the creatures he cared for. Their cruelty rolled off him like rain off a stone, or so it seemed. Among these alien tormentors, Varric stood out as the most relentless. He came from a race known for their physical might and cold detachment, and he took a particular pleasure in making Gavin's life difficult. "How is your little zoo of primitive beasts today, Earthling?" Varric would sneer, his voice dripping with condescension. "Still playing with your pets from that backwater planet of yours?" Gavin rarely responded, and when he did, it was only with a quiet nod or a short, polite phrase. It wasn't that he lacked the spirit to defend himself, but what was the point? These aliens wouldn't understand. They viewed emotion as a weakness, especially the kind of compassion Gavin felt for the creatures in his care. In their eyes, the Earth exhibit was nothing more than a reminder of a lesser world, one that was lucky to even be part of the galactic community. But what the aliens failed to see, what they couldn't understand, was the depth of Gavin's bond with the animals he cared for. Especially with Mara. Mara was unlike any other creature in the Galactic Zoo. She was massive, a towering beast with thick, scaled skin and eyes that seemed to hold an intelligence far beyond what most aliens credited her with. To them, she was just another strange animal from an obscure planet. To Gavin, she was a companion, perhaps the closest thing to a friend he had in this place. Every day, after the mocking laughter of the aliens faded into the background, Gavin would spend hours with Mara. He would speak to her in quiet tones, not expecting her to understand the words, but knowing that on some level, she could feel his presence. There was a calm between them, a connection forged not through language but through shared moments of peace. Mara, in her own way, seemed to sense Gavin's emotions. When he was frustrated or angry, she would grow agitated, pacing in her enclosure until he calmed down. And when he was content, she would lie still, her massive frame curled comfortably in the habitat they had built for her. It was this bond, this understanding, that made Gavin's role in the zoo more than just a job. It gave him purpose. In a galaxy that viewed humans as nothing more than curious pets, Gavin had found a kind of solace in the very creatures the aliens disregarded. He didn't care that they mocked him for it. The quiet connection he had with Mara and the other animals was enough. But the aliens weren't content to leave it at that. Their mockery had an edge to it, a cruelty that seemed to grow sharper with each passing day. They didn't just laugh at Gavin, they resented him. They resented his dedication, his love for these animals, and the way he seemed unaffected by their scorn. Varric, in particular, had begun to take more of an interest in Mara. He would stand outside her enclosure, staring at the beast with an intensity that made Gavin uncomfortable. The zookeeper's instincts told him something wasn't right, but he couldn't place it. He could only wait and hope that his suspicions were wrong. But hope was a fragile thing in the Galactic Zoo. One day, as Gavin was making his rounds, Varric and a few other alien keepers approached him. Their sneers were more pronounced than usual, their laughter louder. "Still wasting your time with that oversized lizard?" Varric asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You humans and your obsession with pets, so weak, so sentimental." Gavin didn't respond. He simply kept walking, his hands clenched at his sides. "You know, Earthling," Varric continued, falling into step beside him, "it's a wonder they let you stay here at all. Surely there's some corner of the galaxy more suited to your kind, some planet where you can spend all your time with creatures as simple-minded as you." The other aliens laughed, but Gavin kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He had learned long ago that engaging with them only made things worse. They thrived on his discomfort, his frustration. The more he resisted, the more they enjoyed it. But as the laughter echoed in his ears, Gavin couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The tension had been building for weeks, the taunts growing more personal, more pointed. And now, with Varric's eyes fixed on Mara's enclosure, Gavin knew that the time for quiet endurance was coming to an end. Something was going to happen. Something terrible. Gavin's day began the same way it always did, with him making his rounds through the Earth exhibit. But it wasn't just routine. Every visit was personal, especially when it came to Mara. She was more than just another creature under his care. From the first moment he had seen her, there was something different about her, something almost human in her eyes. Gavin had always been good with animals, but Mara, she was special. She had been brought to the Galactic Zoo from Earth years ago, back when the zoo was just beginning its experiment of showcasing creatures from lesser-known planets. Most of the aliens in charge had seen Earth as an unremarkable planet with simple life forms, fit only for novelty. But Mara had immediately drawn attention. Her size alone was impressive, but it was her intelligence that had caught Gavin's eye. She wasn't like the other animals. She understood things, far more than anyone gave her credit for. Mara would often follow Gavin's movements with her eyes, her massive head tilting slightly as if she was trying to comprehend more than just his actions. It was something the other aliens never noticed, or perhaps never cared to notice. To them, she was just another creature in a cage. To Gavin, she was a living, breathing reminder of what humanity could accomplish, forging bonds, finding meaning in the smallest moments. Over time, that bond between them had grown deeper. Mara wasn't just an animal he cared for. She was more like a partner, someone, or something, he could trust. There were times when Gavin would sit by her enclosure, talking to her about everything, as if she could understand. He told her stories of Earth, of the landscapes she would never see again, of the sounds and smells of forests and oceans. He would tell her of the stars, the very ones she was now imprisoned beneath. She would listen, her eyes following his every word, her breathing calm and steady. There were moments when Gavin was sure Mara could feel his emotions. If he came to her upset or frustrated from the day's events, she would react, her giant body shifting uneasily, her eyes narrowing as though she sensed his turmoil. And when he was calm, content, she would rest, her head lowering gently to the ground, as if reassured by his presence. It was an unspoken language between them. Words weren't necessary, not when there was a connection like that. Gavin had seen other zookeepers treat their animals with nothing more than the cold efficiency of professionals doing their jobs. But for him, it was never just a job. He cared for each of the creatures in his exhibit, but with Mara, it was different. She understood him, and he understood her. It was something that none of the other keepers could comprehend, least of all the aliens. Varric, especially, was blind to the bond between them. To him, Mara was just another Earth creature, beneath his notice except when he needed something to mock. But Gavin had long since stopped expecting anything different from the alien keepers. They couldn't understand. They didn't see the complexity in creatures like Mara because they didn't value connection, not the way humans did. They saw Earth and its inhabitants as insignificant, and they saw Gavin as even less. But Gavin knew better. He had always known better. In moments of silence, when the rest of the zoo seemed to fade away, Gavin would stand next to Mara's enclosure, watching her as she moved gracefully through her habitat. She was enormous, but her movements were measured, deliberate, as if she understood the space around her in ways no one else did. He admired her strength, her quiet intelligence. It was the kind of wisdom that couldn't be measured in technology or power, the kind that came from something deeper, something older. Mara had learned to trust him completely. When Gavin entered her enclosure to tend to her needs, she would move aside gently, never showing any sign of aggression or fear. She would even approach him, nudging him softly with her massive head, a gesture that could easily have been dangerous if not for the mutual understanding between them. But Gavin never felt afraid. He trusted Mara as much as she trusted him. In a galaxy that viewed humans as little more than an afterthought, that trust meant everything to him. There were days when Gavin would spend hours with Mara, beyond what his duties required. He found peace in her presence, a kind of solace that the sterile, mechanical world of the galactic zoo could never provide. The alien keepers didn't understand why he cared so much about these creatures, least of all Mara. They saw it as a sign of weakness. To them, emotions like compassion and empathy were primitive, relics of less evolved minds. Gavin didn't bother trying to explain it to them anymore. What could they possibly understand about the bond between a human and a creature like Mara? What they failed to grasp was that Mara wasn't just an exhibit for Gavin. She was his anchor, a reminder of everything that made him human. The Galactic Zoo, with its cold metal walls and indifferent keepers, was a place that could easily strip someone of their identity. But Mara kept Gavin grounded. She reminded him of Earth, of what it meant to feel connected to something, even in a place that had long forgotten the importance of such bonds. In return, Gavin gave Mara his absolute devotion. He made sure her environment was as comfortable as possible, adjusting every small detail to ensure she had what she needed. When she showed signs of stress, he would stay with her until she calmed, speaking to her in low, soothing tones. It wasn't that she understood his words, but she understood the intent behind them. Gavin knew that much. But despite the peace they found in each other's presence, there was always a shadow hanging over them, one that Gavin couldn't shake. The other keepers, especially Varric, had started paying more attention to Mara. Their comments, once just mocking and condescending, had begun to take on a different tone, one that was harder to ignore. It was as though they were waiting for something, some moment to exploit. Varric's eyes, in particular, lingered on Mara with a calculating intensity that Gavin didn't like. He had tried to push the feeling aside, to focus on his work and his connection with Mara. But the unease was there, always in the background. Something was coming. He didn't know what, but the quiet moments with Mara, the ones that had once brought him so much peace, were now tinged with a sense of foreboding. Still, Gavin held on to the bond they shared. Whatever the aliens thought, whatever they planned, it didn't change the fact that Mara was more than just an exhibit. She was more than just a creature in a zoo. She was a friend, and Gavin would do anything to protect her. But even as he stood beside her, feeling the quiet comfort of her presence, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The bond between them, as strong as it was, might not be enough to keep the storm that was coming at bay. And deep down, Gavin knew that the peaceful moments he shared with Mara were slipping away, one day at a time. Gavin had always sensed that something was coming, but the day it finally happened, it caught him off guard. He had been tending to another part of the exhibit when he heard the commotion. The sound wasn't natural, it was too sudden, too violent. It didn't fit the usual calm of the zoo, and it set his nerves on edge. His first thought was Mara. Without hesitation, he dropped what he was doing and ran, his mind racing, heart pounding with a growing sense of dread. He knew this day had been coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight that awaited him. Mara lay collapsed in her enclosure, her massive body writhing in pain. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the ground in dark streaks. Something had been done to her, something deliberate. It wasn't just an accident. Gavin could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the undeniable knowledge that this was an attack. He rushed to her side, sliding to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her. Her skin, usually thick and warm, was now cold and clammy. Her breaths came in sharp, labored bursts, each one more strained than the last. Gavin's mind raced, trying to understand what had happened, trying to find a way to help her. But nothing made sense. There was no visible wound, no clear injury, yet it was obvious she was dying. Something inside her had been poisoned, something that was killing her slowly and painfully. He glanced around wildly, looking for any clue, any sign of what had been done to her. And then he saw them, Varric and his gang, standing just outside the enclosure. They weren't even hiding their satisfaction. Varric's eyes gleamed with a cruel amusement, his mouth twisted into a smirk that Gavin wanted to wipe off his face. The other aliens laughed openly, their voices echoing in the quiet space. They had done this. Gavin knew it with absolute certainty. They had come for Mara, and they had succeeded. For a brief moment, Gavin was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer weight of his fury and grief. Everything inside him screamed to act, to lash out, to make them pay. But as he knelt there, his hands resting gently on Mara's side, feeling the rise and fall of her fading breaths, he knew that now was not the time for revenge. Not yet. Mara needed him. He leaned down, his face close to hers, speaking softly, his voice choked with emotion. "Hold on, girl," he whispered. "Hold on for me. I'm here. I'm with you." Mara's eyes, once so bright and intelligent, were dull now, clouded with pain. She shifted slightly at the sound of his voice, her enormous head turning ever so slightly in his direction. Gavin's heart clenched as he saw the effort it took her just to respond. Her body trembled with the strain, and he knew, deep down, that there was nothing he could do to save her. Still, he tried. Frantically, Gavin grabbed his communicator, calling for help. He knew the alien medical teams wouldn't care, wouldn't rush for a creature like Mara, but he had to try. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime, and with each breath, Mara's strength ebbed further away. His fingers fumbled over her thick hide, searching for any sign of what they had done. Poison, a toxin, something had been used, but it was beyond anything he understood. The aliens had made sure of that. As the moments dragged on, it became clear that help wasn't coming. Gavin's desperation turned to helplessness, the weight of reality settling in as he knelt by Mara's side. His beloved animal was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Mara gave a low, guttural sound, a noise that cut through Gavin's heart like a knife. It was her final effort, a sound filled with pain and confusion. Her eyes met his one last time, and in that moment, there was a flicker of recognition, a brief flash of the connection they had always shared. Then, with a heavy, shuddering breath, she went still. Gavin sat frozen, his hands still resting on her side, waiting for her chest to rise again. It didn't. The silence that followed was deafening. Mara, the creature he had cared for, protected, and loved, was gone. The loss hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping for breath, his vision blurred by tears he didn't bother to hold back. Behind him, the sound of laughter broke through the silence. Varric's voice, smug and dripping with satisfaction, echoed in the enclosure. "It's a shame, really," he said, stepping forward, his eyes fixed on Mara's lifeless form. "But that's the problem with your Earth creatures. So fragile." Gavin's body tensed, every muscle coiled with fury. But still, he didn't move. Not yet. Varric wanted him to react, to lash out in anger. He wanted to see Gavin break. But Gavin wouldn't give him the satisfaction. He wouldn't give any of them the satisfaction. Instead, he stood slowly, his back to the aliens, his eyes locked on Mara. He reached out one final time, his fingers brushing against her head in a gesture of farewell. Then he turned to face them, his expression cold, emotionless. Inside, his grief and rage burned like an inferno, but on the surface, he remained calm. Varric's smirk widened as he saw Gavin's face. "What's the matter, human?" he taunted. "Don't you have anything to say? No last words for your precious pet?" Gavin stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his loss crushing him, but something else was building alongside it. A quiet, burning resolve. He glanced at Varric and then at the other aliens, his gaze steady. They expected him to crumble, to break under the weight of his grief. They had no idea what they had just set in motion. Without a word, Gavin turned and walked away. Behind him, Varric's laughter echoed in the distance, but it no longer mattered. The pain of Mara's death was overwhelming, but it was being slowly consumed by something else, something darker, colder. They had taken Mara from him, and for that, they would pay. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Gavin had always been the quiet one, the human who kept to himself, the keeper who took care of the animals no one else cared about. But they had underestimated him, just as they had underestimated Mara. And now, they were going to learn the cost of their arrogance. As Gavin walked away from Mara's lifeless body, one thought consumed him: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days that followed Mara's death were quiet, almost too quiet. Gavin moved through the zoo as he always had, his tasks completed with the same precision and care he'd always shown. To anyone watching, it would have seemed as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Something inside Gavin had hardened. The pain was still there, raw and aching, but now it was accompanied by something sharper, a burning need for justice. He had spent years enduring the mockery of the alien keepers, swallowing his pride, and letting their insults roll off him. They had thought him weak because he didn't respond, because he focused on his work and kept to himself. But they had misunderstood his silence. Gavin wasn't passive by nature. He was patient. And now, that patience was gone. The moment Mara had died, something in him had snapped. He knew he couldn't confront Varric and his gang head-on. They were too powerful, too entrenched in their superiority to listen to reason or care about consequences. But there were other ways. Gavin had spent enough time around them to understand how they operated, how they thought. He knew their weaknesses: arrogance, overconfidence, and a deep-seated belief that humans were beneath them. That was what he would use against them. It began with quiet observation. Gavin kept to his routine, but his eyes and ears were attuned to every detail, every conversation, every interaction between the alien keepers. He watched Varric closely, learning his habits, his patterns. Varric was the leader, but his gang followed him without question. They trusted his strength, his cunning. Gavin would have to dismantle that trust piece by piece, making sure they never saw the threat coming until it was too late. As the days passed, Gavin began to work on something else: his plan. He spent his nights in the zoo's maintenance areas, going over the systems, studying the zoo's layout, and identifying points where he could exert control. He knew the zoo better than anyone. He had spent years learning its inner workings, from the habitats to the security measures. He had always focused on his animals, but now, every bit of that knowledge would serve a different purpose. Gavin didn't have the technology, or the brute strength that Varric and his kind had. What he had was ingenuity. He understood the creatures of Earth, their behaviors, their instincts. More importantly, he understood how to manipulate their environments to trigger specific reactions. He began to experiment, testing small changes in the habitats, observing how the creatures reacted to different stimuli. It wasn't much at first, just subtle shifts in temperature or lighting, but it gave him valuable information he would soon use. The first step of his plan was to isolate Varric. As long as Varric was surrounded by his gang, he was untouchable. But if Gavin could separate him, even for a moment, he could make his move. Varric, like many of the alien keepers, had a routine. Every few days he would patrol the zoo's lower levels, checking on the more dangerous creatures kept in high-security habitats. Gavin knew this because he had seen Varric's comings and goings for years, taking note of his patterns without even realizing it. Now, that information was crucial. Gavin spent days preparing for the moment when Varric would make his rounds alone. He rigged one of the lower-level habitats with a series of small, seemingly insignificant malfunctions, nothing that would trigger a full security alert, but enough to require Varric's personal attention. The habitat in question housed a creature from a distant, toxic world, one that Varric had always found fascinating. It was a creature that required special handling, and Varric, in his arrogance, insisted on managing it himself. Gavin knew Varric would come. And when he did, Gavin would be ready. The day arrived. Gavin watched from a distance as Varric entered the lower levels, his usual swagger in place, confident that he was in control. But this time, Gavin had already put his plan in motion. He had rerouted certain parts of the zoo's security system, creating blind spots where none had existed before. It wasn't easy. Alien technology was far more advanced than anything Gavin had worked with on Earth, but he had learned enough over the years to make it happen. As Varric inspected the habitat, Gavin moved into position. He had carefully set a series of triggers in place, subtle enough that Varric wouldn't notice until it was too late. The first was a small adjustment to the creature's containment field, just enough to make it agitated. Gavin watched from a concealed spot as Varric began to notice the creature's behavior changing. The alien's arrogance kept him from reacting immediately. He believed himself capable of handling anything. That was his mistake. The second trigger was a timed release of a specific sound frequency, one that would drive the creature into a frenzy. Gavin had tested it earlier on smaller, less dangerous animals, ensuring that it would have the desired effect without completely losing control of the situation. As the frequency hit the air, the creature lashed out, slamming against the reinforced barriers of its enclosure. Varric, finally realizing something was wrong, moved to contain the situation, but by then it was too late. Gavin had used the zoo's systems to lock Varric inside the containment area, trapping him with the enraged creature. It was poetic in a way. Varric, who had laughed at Gavin for caring about Earth's creatures, now found himself at the mercy of one. Gavin didn't plan on killing Varric, not yet. That wasn't the goal. This was just the beginning, a lesson. Varric would survive, but he would walk away humiliated, knowing that someone, though not yet knowing who, had outsmarted him. Gavin watched as Varric struggled, barely escaping with his life, his cocky confidence shattered. When the alien finally stumbled out of the habitat, battered and furious, Gavin was already gone, his part in the incident undetected. It wasn't enough to simply defeat Varric. Gavin knew that. This was about sending a message, about making Varric question everything he thought he knew about his superiority. And it worked. Over the next few days, Gavin observed the change in Varric's demeanor. The once arrogant keeper now moved through the zoo with a wary edge, his confidence shaken. His gang noticed it too, though they didn't understand what had caused it. Gavin's plan was working. The cracks in Varric's armor were starting to show. But this was only the first step. Gavin wasn't finished. Varric had taken Mara from him, and that loss was something Gavin would never forget, never forgive. The alien thought himself invincible, untouchable. He had underestimated Gavin, just as he had underestimated the creatures of Earth. That was his greatest mistake. And soon, it would be his downfall. Varric's confidence had been shattered, but Gavin knew that a single humiliation wouldn't be enough to break him entirely. He needed to dismantle Varric piece by piece, methodically, until there was nothing left of the swaggering bully who had taken Mara from him. Varric's fear was now palpable, a crack in the facade that had once been impenetrable. And Gavin was going to widen that crack until it destroyed him. The plan had to move quickly. Varric, despite his bruised ego, would eventually recover, and his gang would regroup. They still had the power, the technology, and the numbers. Gavin had only one advantage: they had no idea it was him. They saw humans as insignificant, so much so that they never considered Gavin as a real threat. It was the very mistake that would be their undoing. The second phase of Gavin's plan involved the zoo itself. Over the years, he had come to understand the intricate systems that controlled every aspect of the place. From the environmental controls in each habitat to the security measures that protected the keepers from the more dangerous creatures, he knew how everything worked. He had even learned the alien tech well enough to make modifications when necessary. Now, those modifications were going to serve a new purpose. Gavin started by disrupting communication between Varric and his gang. He isolated them, using the zoo's security network to create dead zones where their communicators would fail. It was subtle at first, just enough to make them uncomfortable, make them second-guess their surroundings. He wanted them paranoid, disoriented. They had relied too long on their technology, believing it made them untouchable. Without it, they were vulnerable. Varric and his crew began to notice things going wrong. Lights flickered in areas that were supposed to be stable, temperature controls malfunctioned, and the once predictable zoo felt less and less safe. Gavin watched as the alien keepers began to grow uneasy. They still didn't know who was behind it, but they were starting to sense that they were being hunted. The next strike had to be decisive. Varric needed to be confronted, but not in a way he would expect. Gavin wasn't interested in a direct confrontation. Varric would expect that. Instead, he would use Varric's own arrogance and aggression against him. It started with a rumor. Gavin made sure that Varric overheard a conversation between two lesser keepers about a rare and dangerous creature being transferred to the zoo, a creature from a distant, hostile planet. The kind of creature that would appeal to Varric's need to assert his dominance, to prove that he could handle anything. The rumor was fake, of course, but Varric wouldn't know that. Gavin had planted it carefully, making sure Varric would take the bait. Varric, predictably, took the information to his gang, boasting that he would be the one to deal with the new arrival. He insisted on overseeing the transport himself, determined to prove that he was still in control, still the most powerful keeper in the zoo. Gavin watched from the shadows as Varric made his preparations, his pride blinding him to the trap that was being set. When the day of the supposed transfer came, Gavin had everything in place. Varric arrived at the transport bay, flanked by his usual gang. They were eager, confident, completely unaware that the threat wasn't from some mythical beast but from the very environment they had taken for granted. The lights in the bay flickered as Varric approached the containment unit, his brow furrowed in confusion. This wasn't part of the plan, but his arrogance pushed him forward. He barked orders at his crew, insisting that everything was under control, but Gavin had ensured that nothing was. The doors to the transport bay locked behind them with a hiss, sealing them inside. Panic flashed in Varric's eyes, but he quickly masked it, trying to maintain control. That's when Gavin triggered the final part of his plan. The containment unit in the center of the bay opened, not to reveal a dangerous creature but to flood the bay with the same sound frequency that had driven the creature in the lower levels mad. It was an intense, piercing noise, one designed to disorient and incapacitate. Varric's gang crumbled almost immediately, their hands clutching at their heads as they staggered, trying to escape the relentless assault on their senses. Varric fought harder, his pride not allowing him to fall as easily. But even he was weakening, his movements growing sluggish, his bravado giving way to fear. He stumbled toward the control panel, desperately trying to override the lockdown. That's when Gavin stepped out of the shadows. Varric's eyes widened in disbelief as he saw Gavin standing there, calm and composed. In that moment, the realization hit him: it had been Gavin all along. The human he had mocked, the keeper he had belittled, was the one who had orchestrated everything. But it was too late for Varric to do anything about it. Gavin didn't say a word. There was no need for a speech or an explanation. Varric's eyes said it all: the fear, the confusion, the anger. Gavin simply watched as Varric collapsed to his knees, the sound overwhelming him, his body betraying the confidence he had once carried so effortlessly. Gavin walked toward him slowly, methodically. He deactivated the sound frequency with a simple gesture, the silence that followed almost deafening in its own way. Varric gasped for air, his body trembling with the aftershocks of what he had endured. But Gavin wasn't done. He crouched down beside Varric, his voice low and cold. "You thought you could break me," Gavin said quietly. "You thought you could take Mara from me and walk away. But you forgot one thing: humans survive. We endure. And when we fight back, we don't stop until we've finished." Varric's eyes were wide with terror now, the bravado completely gone. He tried to speak, to say something in his defense, but no words came. He was utterly defeated, his gang lying unconscious around him, his pride shattered. Gavin stood, looking down at the broken alien before him. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about justice. Varric would live, but he would never forget this moment. He would never again look at Gavin and see a weak human. He would never again underestimate what humans were capable of. Without another word, Gavin turned and walked away, leaving Varric and his gang in the transport bay. He had won, not through violence or brute force, but through patience, intelligence, and the very thing Varric had mocked him for, his connection to the creatures of Earth. As Gavin left the bay, he felt a sense of finality settle over him. Mara was gone, and nothing could bring her back. But he had honored her memory in the only way he knew how. He had shown the galaxy that humanity was not to be underestimated. And now, even Varric, in his broken state, understood that. This fight was over, but the message had been sent. Humanity was more than they had ever realized.